Paradise Luxury Cruise Ship Craziness. Introduction. Luxurious fun in the sun while sailing along the coast to a distant, faraway, exotic land. What could possibly go wrong in paradise as an adventurous vacation begins? Amongst thousands of seemingly friendly strangers, only time will tell the tale of the crazy corruption aboard this floating hell smack dead in the middle of nowhere. Chapter 1. Blindly Boarding the Boat. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This long-awaited day had finally arrived, the vacation of a lifetime for a group of anxiously excited honor teen graduates. A lavish senior trip before heading to college was just what these happy sailing honorary senior graduates had hoped and prepared for all year. Now only moments away from a fabulous week-long Western Caribbean cruise excursion, the lucky young adults, whom ranged from 17 to 19 years old, laughed aloud. All aboard! Now eagerly waiting their turn in line to check in and board the Tropical Paradise Luxury Cruise, one right after the other, each of the honorary graduates were escorted onto the ship. A total of 111 to be exact. A special trip especially for the honor student senior class, while the rest of the graduating seniors were treated on a trip to a Disney resort and theme park for the weekend. Many other guests were in attendance aboard the cruise ship as well, but for the elated graduates, it was as if they were the only ones there, as they found themselves quickly lost in their own blissful cheer. Chapter 2. Settling in as the ship set sail. Giddy and full of energy, the group rushed with anticipation to their plush rooms awaiting them. Upon arrival to their cabin suite, eyes sparkled with delight as they were mesmerized with their accommodations and amenities. Quickly settling in, the graduates were anxious to regroup and tour the enormous ship for fun and excitement with all of their friends. After savoring the moment in their suite for about 30 minutes or so, many changed into something more comfortable and then went to meet their handler escorts in the common area of the ship, whom had accompanied them on their trip. The brief meeting was to go over safety tips and to provide them with ship maps and itineraries of events. After the brief lecture from Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner, the group of graduates were free to do what they will, while also being prompted of the reminder all meal times was check-in time with their escorts. No one was to disembark or leave the ship without their supervision or permission. Any and all activities abroad while the ship was docked in any area for an extended period of time would be done together as a group for their own safety and security. Everyone in attendance understood and was in agreement of the rules and regulations. Now it was time to let the fun begin, or so they thought. All 111 graduates scattered in different directions, although many partnered with their roomies or their besties, in search of leisure and entertainment before dinner check-in at 7 p.m. Chapter 3. Let the games begin. Time seems to fly when you're having fun, but the day was still young as the sun shined brightly high in the clear skies above. Everybody aboard the Tropical Paradise Luxury Cruise seemed to be filled with joy, laughter, and cheer. There was something of interest for everyone to do, whereas there wasn't a dull moment throughout the day. Interestingly enough, the cruise staff seemed to pay very close attention to particularly the graduate students on the cruise, more so than any other guests the most. Small chatter amongst the youngsters found this to be kind of odd. However, they were having way too much fun to pay the matter any more attention. Several of the attending groups made their way to the pool area for a bit of some splish splash splash thrills and to mix and mingle with others before dinner. Others occupied the arcade, gift shop, spa, and other activities available in cooler areas on this extremely hot day. But many anticipated nightfall to arrive for the big party that was to take place at the cruise club. With so much to do or experience, this week-long trip is bound to be adventurous. Chapter 4, Stranger Things. The guests attending the second dinner at 7 p.m. began to retreat to their suites around 6 p.m. to ready themselves for a lavish meal, live entertainment, and a meet and greet with the captain. Excitement and steady traffic reigned through the ship from all areas as the guests enjoyed themselves to the fullest. 6:45 p.m. The grads, finally dressed for the evening engagements, began to make their way to the designated meetup location with their cruise handlers/chaperones for a quick check-in and head count before being escorted to the dining area. By 6:55 p.m., all 111 graduates surely checked in as expected and proceeded to the dining room. Upon arrival, a special section was set aside just for the graduate students. It became very apparent the group was definitely getting special treatment and service. The captain even personally introduced himself, welcoming the honored graduate students. There was even 6 servers that were solely assigned to them specifically. The eager group ordered their drinks and meals and then enjoyed the live band while waiting on their food. Everybody was so polite and overly nice to the point of feeling like everything was staged or a bit arranged. However, the meal was prompt and scrumptious. The hungry group eagerly savored every bite. Dinner ended around 8:30 p.m. and finally everybody aboard the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise was ready to party. Many found pleasure in the casino or at the bar, while the vast majority of the young people ran to the club to dance the night away. The DJ was jamming, music was blasting, and the dance floor was packed as the disco ball flashed rapidly with glimmering lights. Yet again, several of the ship's cruise staff lurked around creepily, focusing their attention on the graduates all too much. Before long, the DJ announced free refreshments were available in the rear of the club and everybody was welcome to help themselves. The crowd cheered aloud as many in attendance took advantage of the freebies offered to them. Little did they know, the punch was spiked with alcohol, which soon became apparent as the partiers began to stagger about. As more and more frequent trips to the bathroom began to happen, no one quite noticed of those whom vanished into the night, never returning back to the club again. Chapter 5, Weird Occurrences with No Explanation. Day 2. A lovely experience thus far on a cruise of a lifetime, but other guests and the staff were surely acting very suspicious. The first day aboard the cruise was great, although later that night at the club, somebody had spiked the punch. The students drank that was especially arranged for them and their enjoyment. Many appeared to be very intoxicated, staggering about on the dance floor, and it was assumed perhaps one of the students intended to play a cruel prank on the others, so the matter wasn't researched or investigated any further, and no complaints were made to the group's handlers or the staff in attendance. With everyone scattered about in all different directions, it was believed The end of the night, all the graduates, along with more than 1,000 other guests, made it back to their cabin suite safely. 8:30 a.m. and all the early birds was up and about preparing themselves for a savory breakfast. Around 9 a.m. the group met in their designated spot, but after about 15 minutes waiting, 6 of the graduates hadn't arrived for check-in yet. However, second day on the ship, the entire day would be spent cruising the seas on the way to the Bahamas. So the group handlers figured the 6 absent had just overslept and didn't want breakfast, and made mention they couldn't possibly be anywhere else, since no one could have left the ship. With that being said, everyone made their way to the breakfast buffet. During the meal, everybody's topic of conversation were the 6 graduates who were absent. Ironically enough, each pair of them were roommates, so it was definitely weird neither of them had arrived for check-in as mandatory, even if they didn't want breakfast. But the handlers, Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner, literally didn't seem to be bothered by the issue at all. Not to mention, these were the same graduates that left the club the night before early, while visibly being seen highly intoxicated. Did they indeed go to their rooms, crash, and is currently sleeping off a bad hangover? Or perhaps the small group of them are hanging out together elsewhere? Nobody knows. Nevertheless, everybody finished their meals and departed separately to begin their day filled with numerous fun activities like swimming, rock climbing, the spa, casino, etc. The day was long at sea, cruising on the way to our first destination on the ship's itinerary, a perfect day at Coco Cay, Bahamas. Everybody was so excited to get to the island to explore its many adventures. Chapter 6, Missing in Action. By nightfall and late dinner accommodations, yet and still, there was no sight of the missing graduates. Many had allowed the joy and pleasantries of the day to make them forget all about the matter. But by now, it was 7:30 p.m. and surely concern should have been risen. Something isn't right, thought the small group of curious student graduates that pondered for answers, or at least a reasonable explanation. With the group's handlers nowhere to be found on such a large ship, the few busybodies seeking clarity decided they'd take matters into their own hands by alerting ship's security. Laura, Amy, Timothy, and Clara set off to find the nearest security guard, which didn't take them long to do, with several staff on every level. Once making contact, the group relayed their concerns anxiously, at which time the security officers told the graduates not to worry and that they would surely look into the matter right away. Although a report was indeed made, the security officer didn't seem to respond with any urgency. In fact, Officer Randy Smalls appeared rather suspicious in his demeanor, as well did he take a very lighthearted approach about the issue altogether. There was nothing more the young adults could do but wait for further notice. In the meantime, the group of them tried to free their minds with a fun activity by partaking in rock climbing and miniature golf. Chapter 7, Lost in the Sauce. By 9 p.m., many guests filled the bar, dance club, casino, bingo, and sports deck, and big screen movies to occupy their night. With around 2,000 guests, there definitely wasn't a dull moment. There was something for everybody, which rendered a pleasing, appeasing experience. No emergency announcements were made about the missing graduates, nor was there any further information provided about their whereabouts. Concern turned to despair which led to fear for worrying parties wondering about those whom had seemingly vanished into thin air without a trace. Laura and Amy suggested to Timothy and Clara they should search the ship themselves, since they couldn't get any answers from anyone else. They all agreed to do so by first going to check the missing graduates' staterooms. About 10:30 p.m., the group started their search. Daniel and Samson's room was the first that they checked. After several minutes of knocking at the door with no answer, the group reluctantly proceeded to walk away. Only after a few steps down the hall, all of a sudden, a door opened and the group quickly turned around. Only to their surprise, they see housekeeping exiting Daniel and Samson's room. Ironic, housekeeping would be in a guest room so late. The group eagerly asked the attendant if they had seen their friends. With a crooked smile upon the pale, ghostly, blank face of the housekeeper, she replied in response to the question with a firm no. Not at all. As if it was a bother for the group to be inquiring about other guests in the first place. As the attendant swayed past the group, she nonchalantly added, "The stateroom is completely empty and vacant." Eyes bucked wide. The group was utterly shocked and instantly felt something was horribly wrong. Not to mention, it was even weirder. The housekeeping attendant would be cleaning an empty, vacant room so late at night. Where was Daniel and Samson? And could the others missing be with them? But why would their room be empty? So many questions boggled the concerned graduate's mind. They were determined to find answers, so they rushed to find the others with any luck. The curious grad detectives crept through the halls of the ship until they reached Daisy and Sandra's room. Once again, no answer to their knocks, and it was eerily quiet. A few doors down was Tabitha's and April's stateroom, and yet again, unanswered knocks lingered. But this time, the room door was ajar, which swung open to a darkened room. The group peered at each other in hesitation before taking baby steps into the darkness of the room. Timothy quickly reached for the nearest light. As he did, the door slammed shut behind him, which startled the group, who jumped in an instant fear. As they looked around, the room was empty and clean. There wasn't even any luggage in the room. What in the hell, the group of them thought. Something was beyond wrong, but even more so, something sinister had happened and must be being covered up. Timothy's father is a detective whom taught him a lot about investigating. Besides his own passion for one day working for the FBI, Timothy, without a shadow of doubt, knew something wasn't right at all. Laura, Amy, and Clara was frightened to death at this point, but Timothy insisted they search other areas of the ship, like all the areas off limits to the guests. The girls wasn't so sure, but Timothy was adamant about finding their friends. Chapter 8, The Hunt. Without further delay, the frightened group crept their way through the halls of each level of the ship until they reached the below deck, which was strictly off limits to the passenger guests. Acting as normal as possible and trying their best not to draw attention to themselves, the nervous, curious graduates managed to make it past security and other staff without any attention being drawn to them or an altercation. Funny thing is, it almost seemed too easy, not to mention very eerie, because the group felt that they were being watched although no one seemed to pay them any particular attention. Afraid that they could get caught and in big trouble in any moment, the four hurried as their eyes glanced in a flash in every direction as they walked arm in arm together, looking all around for any sign of their missing friends. With no idea where they were exactly, and the lingering silence surrounding them, panic began to set in as they continued to walk further into a maze leading in different directions. Some areas were labeled crew cabins, which the grads tried their best to avoid. Before long, they reached an area and could see several cells, which startled them because they had no idea such a thing existed on a cruise ship. Then they heard faint noises, which sounded like screeching voices at a distance. This shocked them, thinking someone was surely coming up behind them, and they had nowhere to hide. But the noises seemed to be closer than they thought, because the further they walked, the closest the voices sounded. Timothy discovered several other doors alongside the jail cells, but they couldn't see through the rooms. There was one sealed room in particular the whimpers were coming from. The group, very much intrigued, gathered to listen closer to see if they could hear any clearer. But just as they did, two tall, buff guards cornered them. Panicked and scared for their lives, all four of the graduates screamed as loud as they possibly could. "What the hell are you doing down here?" one of the security guards yelled with intensity as he snatched Timothy up by the collar, practically lifting him off of his feet. Frozen in fear, Timothy couldn't seem to utter one word, so Amy blurted out, "We're looking for our missing friends," with a snappy attitude. "Oh yeah? This is the little group that has been creeping around the housekeeper told us about," said the other guard to his partner. With the most sinister look upon his face, the bulky, overbearing guard said, "Well, you've come to the right place." Not sure what he meant, and ready to get out of there as fast as possible, Laura asked, could they go? The guards laughed out loud and said, "But I thought you were looking for your friends, little one." What a creep, Laura thought. Before any of them knew it, the security guard unlocked one of the doors to the sealed room and said, "There they are, honey. Now all y'all can join them." Timothy, Laura, Amy, and Clara were thrown into a padded room jail cell with their missing friends, who all looked heavily drugged. Clara tried to make a run for it to get help, but the security guard chased her down fast, quick, and in a hurry, grabbed her by her hair, and dragged her back into the cell. Chapter 10. Caught Up. The door was slammed shut and locked. Now all 10 of them were trapped below deck in a padded cell, and no one could hear them scream. Laura, Amy, Timothy, and Clara all cried profusely as they peered at their friends, Daniel, Samson, Daisy, Sandra, Tabitha, and April, who all looked too weak to barely say a word, although they tried. It was painfully obvious that they were high on something. No wonder the staff appeared to be overly nice, especially to their group of graduates aboard the ship. Timothy thought aloud. "They were surveillancing us all along," he said. The girls' worst fears were confirmed when Timothy then made mention to the fact the ship that they're on is running a human trafficking operation. All the poor graduates could do was cry. All of a sudden, they heard a beeping noise, and Laura instantly remembered she had her phone. The beep was a low battery alert, but she didn't have a signal to make a call. What little hope they had slowly drifted away. Timothy said they had to fight back every chance that they got before they came back to drug them too. Then they would be too weak to do so. They all anxiously waited. Surely someone would notice all of them gone and send a search party to find them soon enough. Their handlers would definitely get worried by check-in as to their whereabouts. Chapter 11, Wonderland. Day 3. A perfect day at Coco Cay, Bahamas, was fast approaching as the ship was only hours away from its first port of call. Guests aboard anxiously waited as they prepared themselves to depart the ship to explore the island and leisurely activities available. A beautiful day at Coco Cay, Bahamas. The sun shined brightly high in the sky as the waters sparkled and glistened all around the island. Nearly every guest in attendance departed the ship upon arrival. Laughter and cheer rang through the air as everyone parted ways in different directions in search of adventures. Oddly enough, no one thought to mention or even search for the missing graduates that seemingly vanished into thin air. Nevertheless, with so many things to do, there wasn't any dull moment for the partying wanderers. Obviously, not really watching their surroundings, while many indulged and was highly under the influence that left nothing but space and opportunity for danger to lurk in the shadows on the island. Ignorant to the current circumstance, the guests had no idea to the major operation going on right under their nose and the evil that surrounded them all. With already 10 missing, no one could guess that wasn't the end to the creepy captor's madness. Eagerly enough, things went as planned throughout the day and was done in an orderly fashion by the staff standards at least. The cruise itinerary displayed a schedule to stay at Coco Cay all day and night, not setting sail again until early on day 4. The cruise guests could enjoy themselves any way they liked, whether spending all their free time on the island or either leisurely entertaining themselves aboard the luxurious cruise ship. The graduates of honor from Florida Esteem Preparatory Academy were having a blast and living it up to the fullest. Meanwhile, the missing grads remained imprisoned below deck on the ship, all 10 badly dehydrated and still heavily drugged while slumbered in weakness, regret, and in and out of consciousness. By now, Mr. Sinner and Miss Honeypot were definitely aware several of the graduates are missing. However, they acted as if there wasn't a thing wrong, constantly reassuring the others that everything was perfectly fine. But it wasn't fine, and the chaperones knew it. At this point, they knew more than what they were saying and covering something up. One student grad in particular was aware of this and secretly decided to investigate on his own. Andrew. Sure, the cruise ship staff and even the chaperones were hiding something which gave him a very uneasy feeling. Chapter 12. Nothing to see here. Andrew was determined to either find out the truth or alert the authorities and his parents as soon as possible. As of now, no one knew Andrew was curious at all about what was going on, as he tried to keep a low profile while he secretly peeped everything and everyone out. Andrew comes from a very high society, prestigious family. After all, his father is a judge, mother a high-profile lawyer with her own firm, and his uncle is the chief of police where he resides. Andrew's family comes from a long line of law and order. and he was surely expected to keep the family's legacy going. Needless to say, Andrew undoubtedly would find out soon enough the malicious misdeeds and criminal activity going on, as he felt it was his duty to do so, and put to good use of the private investigator's skills he'd learned from his cousin. While on this mission, Andrew vowed to stay sober to keep a clear mind, but he proceeded to mix and mingle with the others as if nothing was wrong at all. No one was the wiser of what he was up to, as he frequently stopped to periodically take notes about what he saw. It was amazing how everyone was in their own little world without a care. It was as if no one had a second thought about the growing number of graduates that would seemingly disappear. Chapter 13, Playdate. It was like they were all under some kind of mind control or something, or perhaps just submerged in ignorant fun and excitement. I suppose it's just hard for everyone to keep an eye out on their entire group, considering there was well over 100 of them in attendance, Andrew thought to himself as he wandered about, highly alert and suspicious of everybody, while sipping his iced tea. The one thing that stood out the most while on the Coco Cay Island was Mr. Center and Mrs. Honeypot were awfully close, touchy-feely, and very much intoxicated, as they flirted with each other openly like it was nobody's business. Ironically enough, they both are married with children, but obviously that was of no concern. It's no wonder they couldn't keep up with the graduates they were being paid to chaperone. They just took it upon themselves to make this vacation a little rendezvous of their own. Andrew wasted no time at all adding his recent findings to his notes. He couldn't wait to expose the freaky duo to his father, whom he discussed everything with. Little did Andrew know that was only the tip of the iceberg, although scandalous, as if maybe something way more serious, dangerous, and sinister was happening in the shadows. Throughout the day and night, Andrew took notes, recorded audio and video, as well as various snapshots. Chapter 14, Something Something Just Ain't Right. The later in the evening it got, Andrew developed a severe migraine headache. Feeling sluggish and nauseated, Andrew just figured he was extremely tired, so he headed back to the ship to retreat for a while in his cabin estate room to try to get some rest and review his notes before snooping around to see what else he could find out. It was now late in the day, and Andrew had suddenly remembered he hadn't eaten anything, so upon his arrival to his room, he ordered some room service. When his dinner arrived, Andrew wasted no time digging in. It seems as if that's exactly what he needed to reboot his energy, because the club sandwich, chef salad, chocolate pie, and sparkling water surely hit the spot. After which, Andrew sat on his balcony deck reviewing his notes, and from time to time finding himself dazing off into a daydream while staring at the clear night sky and ocean view. Rubbing his head and eyes in confusion, Andrew discovered there were a total of 10 graduates unaccounted for. As he looked over the check-in roster, he thought up until that point it were only the small group of roommates nobody had seen since their first night on the cruise. It was now day 3 and several more were just gone. Baffled by this, Andrew immediately jumped up to email his mom and dad. Long-winded and rambling, Andrew attempted to explain the situation. It was as if the severity of the issue sent him into overdrive as he typed rapidly. Since it was late, Andrew knew he likely wouldn't get a reply from his parents until the next day. In the meantime, Andrew tried to keep his cool as he thought frantically on his next move. He needed a plan but had no idea where to start, so he sent the same concerning message to his private investigator cousin, Doug, for any ideas on what to do. Shockingly, Andrew's cousin Doug emailed him back right away. Just as Andrew received the message, he was startled by a disturbingly loud knock at his door. Just a tad bit anxious and afraid to answer the door, Andrew rushed to hide his laptop, phone, and camera. As he yelled out, "Yeah, who is it?" then waited patiently for a reply. Andrew and his parents are rich, so the couple could afford a luxurious suite for their son by himself, as he didn't want to bunk with anybody else. Nevertheless, because of this fact, he wasn't expecting any visitors. "It's Miss Honeypot, hun. Open up." A dainty yet slurred voice spake out. "Oh, okay," Andrew responded. As he breathed a sigh of relief, the door swung open, but of course, Miss Honeypot was wasted. Yet thought to check on Andrew? He had never seen Miss Honeypot in such a way, being the sophisticated socialite she normally carried herself as. Chapter 16. What the fuck? Andrew had never seen Miss Honeypot in such a way, being the sophisticated socialite she normally carried herself as. "Hi dear," she said. "Just wanted to make sure you were doing okay." "Yeah, fine." Miss Honeypot, Andrew said. "Well, alrighty then, hun. Good night." Miss Honeypot blurted out as her breath reeked of liquor. "Oh, by the way, hun, do you need anything for your headache or stomach pain?" What? I mean, no, I'm fine," Andrew said agitatedly. "Have a nice night, hun." "Fine," Andrew closed the door and began pacing the floor. How in the hell did Miss Honeypot know he didn't feel well when he left the island? And how did she know he was in his suite, Andrew thought. But more importantly, why didn't she go check on or attempt to find the missing graduates like she did him? So many questions and random thoughts crossed Andrew's mind. Something was definitely horribly wrong. And more so than that, Andrew now knew he was being watched, even in his room. Andrew remembered the message he got from his cousin, and he ran to read it and update his family what had just happened. After he sent his second message, all of a sudden, Andrew's Wi-Fi went out. He knew he had paid for the most premium package for Wi-Fi aboard the cruise, so there was no reason for it to go out all of a sudden. Somebody was watching and didn't want Andrew to get any messages to his family about what was going on. Not to mention, Miss Honeypot had just tried to get Andrew to take some kind of supposed pain pill. She was likely trying to drug him, Andrew thought. This is beyond serious, and Andrew knew his life was in danger. Chapter 17. The suspense is cringe. Day 4. Departure. After a wild night the day before, the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise was ready to now depart from the Bahamas to set sail on a day-long cruising at sea to our next destination to Cozumel, Mexico. Andrew didn't sleep a wink as he was frozen in fear about what he had endured. The Wi-Fi stayed out all night too. All the other guests were seemingly fine, and everyone made it back to the ship on time. Andrew's parents never responded back to him. But even if they did, he probably wouldn't have gotten an alert for the message, being he had no signal. Luckily, Andrew did get his cousin Doug's last email before the Wi-Fi went out. Doug vaguely told Andrew what to do and what to look for in his email. He also stressed he'd contact his parents and the police if he didn't hear back from him. Andrew took his cousin's advice and decided since everyone would be on the ship a whole day, then it would be the perfect time to scope everything out as he investigated his missing friend's disappearance. Andrew made sure to keep his phone and camera on him as he finally left his room to join the others. Thankfully, no one else vanished into thin air, but Andrew knew to be cautious and stay focused on the mission while trying to blend in and act as normal as possible. Chapter 18. Playing Along. Check-in before breakfast went awkwardly well. Besides Andrew's friends swarming him and wondering where he had been since last night, Mr. Center and Mrs. Honeypot kept giving Andrew the side eye, which was weird. There was 99 other graduates they could pay attention to, but for some reason they kept focusing in on him. Andrew told his friends all was well, but he just didn't feel well the night before, explaining he just needed to eat and he was fine. Laughing off the matter, Andrew refrained from telling any of his friends about what happened or what he knew. His friends understood and set making plans for what they wanted to do for the day. Andrew noticed that the staff, yet and still, were overly focused on their group. All the other guests, they paid close attention to them solely, being overwhelmingly nice and eager to cater to them, as if they were told to do so by someone. It was strange to say the least. Nothing was wrong with being polite, but the cruise staff went over and beyond to invade the graduates' personal space. No matter where the group went, even when everyone split up and went in different directions, they were monitored very closely. Andrew tried to loosen up and have a bit of fun with his friends, who didn't suspect a thing and was having the time of their lives. With so much to do aboard the ship, the rambunctious bunch paced themselves from one activity to the next until lunchtime. After the group's late lunch, Andrew and his friends went by his suite to secretly smoke some weed Andrew smuggled on the ship. However, when they reached Andrew's room and began to unwind, Andrew knew something was wrong. All of Andrew's things were thrown about as if someone was frantically searching for something. That's when Andrew realized his laptop was missing. Someone had broken into his room, who obviously had a key to get in. Andrew was enraged and picked up the house phone to alert the security of the problem. Andrew was pissed, and the people at the service desk just calmly took his report and said they'd look into the matter. Andrew had a feeling it was a staff member who did it in the first place, and they knew exactly what was going on. Chapter 19. Evil Live. Andrew, without a shadow of doubt, knew whoever took his laptop was now aware of him sending messages to his family and what those emails said. Andrew asked his friends if any of them had a signal or Wi-Fi on their phone, whom all replied no. Damn, Andrew thought, as the group finished smoking and left his suite. Andrew's pretty spoiled, so he was fuming over the situation. As would anybody be upset, but Andrew's friends had never seen him as angry as he currently was. Andrew figured hanging with his group of friends would keep him safe, but he knew he needed to branch off away from them to go searching and continue his investigation into those whom are still missing. The teen grads wanted to drink and party the rest of the day, as they had become accustomed to being served alcohol freely. But Andrew wasn't feeling it. Something else Andrew made a note of, even though they all ranged in the age of 17 to 19, the crews constantly supplied them with liquor throughout the duration of the cruise. Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot knew this and totally didn't mind. Like that small detail was all a part of their evil plan. By now, Andrew felt like the chaperones were definitely in on the setup of whatever was going on. A feeling that proved true when Andrew overheard a conversation between the two. Chapter 20, Smoking Gun. Trying to get his feelings in check, Andrew and a couple of his guy buddies made a dash for the public restroom aboard the ship. Even though Kenneth and James were preoccupied chatting about good-looking girls on the cruise they had met, Andrew was uninterested because he was too much in a zone. On the way to the restroom, the guys bypassed the lounge. Many of the older guests found comforting, which is where Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot were having cocktails over what seemed to be an intense conversation. Andrew snapped a few pictures of the intimate pair. Andrew told his friends to go ahead of him and he'd catch up. The chaperones' backs were turned to the doorway, even though they sat close by the entrance, which is how Andrew heard their shocking conversation. Mr. Sinner joked about how many of the students were getting buck wild on the trip thus far. Agreeing in amusement, Miss Honeypot laughed aloud and said, "Yeah, many of them didn't know what hit them after their drinks were spiked." Andrew couldn't believe what he was hearing, so he grabbed his phone to record. Mr. Sinner made mention to being unsure how many more they could offer up. Andrew was shocked in amazement and wondered if Mr. Sinner was referring to the missing graduates. All at once, a firm hand patted Andrew on the shoulder. It was one of the security staff members. Startled, Andrew quickly put his phone away. "Can I help you with something, young man?" the guard said, matter-of-factly. Just then, Mr. Sinner and Miss Honeypot turned around, giving him a death stare. "No, not at all," Andrew replied to the guard, whom nodded and gave a secretive gesture to the chaperones. To play it off, Andrew acted like he was looking for the chaperones to ask a question, so he slowly walked toward their table, leaving the guard behind. Andrew had to think quickly, so he just asked outright what was on his mind. Andrew looked at Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot and asked in a very agitated manner, "What's going on and where are the missing graduates?" Andrew was anxious and angry by now and wanted answers as to why no one was concerned. Several people were missing. Andrew was loud enough to get everybody's attention that was in the lounge and at the bar. Mr. Sinner stood up and boldly said to Andrew, "I think you just better settle down now." Mrs. Honeypot interrupted, stating, "Just calm down, Andrew. We understand your frustrations, but there is nothing to worry about, dear." Andrew shook his head. "Oh, really?" he said. "Well, something is definitely wrong. And I know you two know the truth. 10 students have been missing for 3 to 4 days now, and nobody is concerned. Not to mention, my room was broken into and my laptop conveniently went missing after my Wi-Fi was cut off all of a sudden. And I just heard you all laughing about the grads drinking and their drinks being spiked." Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot just looked at each other in a silent, non-verbal way of communicating with one another. By now, the other guests in the lounge were shocked and whispering amongst themselves as they had no idea that anybody was missing up till now. Andrew's friends had found him and overheard everything and rushed in to come whisk him away. Andrew never did get a clear message or answer from the chaperones or the staff. They all seemed to scatter about frantically as they all had this look like a major bomb had just been dropped. Chapter 21. The lies they tell, the secrets they keep. There was dead silence at dinner as hardly anyone had an appetite in light of recent events. News traveled fast, especially within a confined area like a cruise ship. Those in the know of the situation knew tensions were on high, but others who heard about what happened in the lounge was curious to know what might take place next. Even other guests aboard the ship grew fond of the outcome of the situation and the missing graduates. When the eerie silence and cold hard stares couldn't be ignored any longer, Mrs. Honeypot decided to address the group in attendance. Miss Honeypot, fiery red-haired, dangled down her back as her pale skin appeared flawlessly cold. She wore a fitted pencil skirt and a low-cut lace blouse that flaunted her busty cleavage, obviously looking as if she had someone to impress on a hot date as she stood and pranced about in her 6-inch stiletto heels. "Attention, fellow graduates," Miss Honeypot said. "I have an announcement." Everybody sat in anticipation and didn't blink one eye. Mrs. Honeypot continued in saying, "We are aware of everyone's concerns regarding the few displaced students." "Few?" Andrew shouted. "You mean 10 who vanished into thin air, right?" Mrs. Honeypot instantly grew angry and slightly raised her voice as she turned bloodshot red. "Okay, yes, fine, the 10 students missing. But I assure you all, everything is under control, and I'm sure they'll be found safe and sound," she said, ridiculously continuing her remarks by alluding to the fact there are a lot of people aboard the cruise and perhaps that they met new friends that they are hanging out with. It was the most disgusting lie the girl had ever heard. They had literally been missing for 4 days now, and no one had even seen or heard from them at all. Everybody shook their head in amazement, but Andrew wasn't buying the bogus explanation. He was never particularly disrespectful, but he had heard enough. Andrew stood up from the table and yelled across the room, "That's bullshit, and you know it." Before storming off, Andrew also warned the graduates to watch their drinks because they were being spiked. "Oh, and by the way, don't leave anything of value in your rooms either, because it'll come up missing." Afterwards, Andrew and his friends left the dining room as Miss Honeypot stood there with her hands on her hip, looking like crap had just been thrown in her face. Of course, Mr. Sinner, unfocused on anyone else, rushed to Miss Honeypot's aid in an attempt to console her. The rest of the group ditched the lame dinner meeting and went about their business in all different directions as well. Andrew and his friends wandered about in search of the nearest chill spot to sit and smoke, seeing as it was getting dark out. Chapter 22. The plot thickens. Since somewhat everything was out in the open, Andrew decided to let his friends in on everything he knew during their smoke session. From the affair between Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot, the spiked drinks with alcohol and date rape drugs, the cringe invasive staff, the fact that there were 10 missing students instead of just the 6 roommates they originally knew about on day 2 of the cruise, the creepy visit late at night by Mrs. Honeypot, the secret cameras being spied on, the emails he sent, and then his stolen laptop, and then blocked from Wi-Fi. He told him everything that he knew. It was a lot to take in, but the small, intimate group still didn't know where the missing teens went, or that a major trafficking operation was the real cause of the problem. Trying to be safe, the group agreed to only drink bottled water from then on until they were off the ship. With only 4 more days aboard the ship, the grads were hoping nothing else bad could happen. But frankly, nothing could prepare them for the dangers that were lurking all around them, or what was going to happen next. Along with Andrew was his friends Lance, Kenneth, James, Sarah, Bethany, and Rachel. They all agreed to stick together for the rest of the night. They all were pretty bummed about everything that had happened thus far, but they didn't want to waste a good time either. None of them had bothered eating dinner earlier in the day, so after smoking, they all had the munchies and decided to order up a lot of food and snacks. While the group awaited their feast, the missing graduates being held hostage under deck weren't doing so good. Still confined like animals, they just barely were supplied food and water. Yet they were kept drugged repeatedly, often causing them to pass out from either exhaustion or being overly stimulated with substance. Little did the other graduates know, but a secret meeting was taking place in the staff quarters, which consisted of Mr. Sinner, Mrs. Honeypot, a few security staff, and the captain of the ship. The heated discussion was about Andrew, of course, and the growing whispers amongst the guests about the missing teens. One of the guards suggested getting rid of Andrew as soon as possible. The captain replied the situation was already being handled. What about the agreed upon deal, Mr. Sinner interrupted. You only have 10 of them when it's supposed to be 15. By the time the ship reached Mexico, he stated. Head of security suggested that the sacrifices will have to take place in some other manner because they couldn't risk exposure if any other persons went missing on the ship. Too many guests are aware of what's going on now. Yes, the captain agreed. We need to focus our attention on Andrew and his friends. Okay, but what about the other 5 teens whose parents are expecting compensation from the setup? Miss Honeypot blurted out. We will have to deal with that later, said the captain. Chapter 23, Fatal Deadly Danger. One of the wait staff getting off of her shift from the day lingered in the background as she eavesdropped, listening in on the conversation the captain had with his counterpart, culprits. Working aboard the ship for 5 years now, Stacy knew of the criminal activity that went on, as did she know to turn a blind eye if she wanted to keep her job or stay alive. Stacy knew all too well that even staff members had come up missing aboard the cruise ship before. Lost without a trace, and no one aware that they were either murdered in cold blood or trafficked and sold into sex slavery. But only this time, Stacy couldn't believe what she was hearing. The parents of the missing teens are in on the setup for the huge payday too? How awful, Stacy thought, and to think, in the end, when the shit hits the fan, they'll all play pretend to be so heartbroken by the news of their children missing. And here Stacy thought being an orphan was so bad. But who in the hell needs parents when they'll just sell you out and throw you to the wolves for their very own ill wills and compensation? It's an evil, wicked world after all, she thought. By now, Andrew and his 2 little crew had a party of their own going on. At last, the group's food arrived and they all dug in. As agreed, they all had bottled water with their meal, but the kitchen staff noticed this and had yet another trick up their sleeves. Andrew's food was laced with poison, and all the bottled waters had been tampered with by injecting a liquid drug into the water with a needle. Despite their safety attempts, Andrew and his friends were drugged and poisoned anyway. Before long, the entire group appeared drunk, and Andrew started feeling ill right away, vomiting up everything he had just eaten. Sarah, Bethany, and Rachel could barely stand, and eventually Sarah passed out altogether. Security was all too eager to help the girls to their room as they were separated from the guys. James and Kenneth staggered about trying to help Andrew, and Lance just left the group hanging. But Andrew grew angry, knowing something was done to them. He told his friends to just leave him alone, while he frantically tried to use his phone again. Andrew still couldn't make a call just yet because of the weak signal strength, but the Wi-Fi was on again, so he emailed his parents to tell them what was going on. Kenneth and James decided to do as Andrew asked and gave him some space. However, they weren't moving as fast as they thought because they had only gotten a few feet away. Kenneth and James were big and tall, solid all-American guys. Even though they felt drunk and high, they were still alert enough to get around. With their backs turned, walking slowly in the opposite direction, all of a sudden they heard a loud scream and a splash that got everybody's attention. When Kenneth and James turned around, Andrew was gone with nothing left but his shoes and his phone left behind. Everybody ran to the rail along the ship and looked over. No one could see anything but black darkness and the rapid waves of the water. Andrew had gone overboard. A little old lady shouted. Kenneth and James, seeing a distant figure, rushed away from the scene as everyone gathered. Both Kenneth and James were crushed and knew Andrew had been pushed or thrown overboard. Several of the other graduates and the chaperones, along with security staff, began to show up. Kenneth grabbed Andrew's phone before anybody else could, and they all sat there in mourning of their friend while a supposed investigation went on. To no surprise, Ms. Honeypot and Mr. Sinner seemed way too calm as others cried profusely. Security alerted the ship's captain to recent events, whom alerted the Coast Guard of the possibility of someone going overboard. Search and rescue were on the way, but the captain refused to stop the ship and proceeded to their next port of call anyway. Security who had come to whisk the girls away had taken them to their respective rooms. Sarah and Bethany shared a cabin together, and Rachel was roommates with another student. But Kenneth and James wanted to check on the girls and tell them what had just unfortunately happened with Andrew. When James and Kenneth reached the girls' rooms, all they could hear was faint sobs and crying peering through the door. What now? James thought as he banged on the door as loud as possible, announcing himself so the girls would know that it was them. The door crept open slowly and Sarah collapsed in James' arms. Both Sarah and Bethany were completely nude. Kenneth hurried to shut the door and fetch the girls some bath towels to cover them up. Bethany laid froze in fear across the bed. They had bruises all over their bodies, busted lips, and black eyes. Blood soaked the sheets, and their clothes had been literally cut off of them. The girls had been brutally and viciously raped by multiple men. Kenneth and James couldn't believe their eyes. They had never seen such a thing. The girls were obviously virgins because they both were ripped from front to back. Sarah and Bethany needed help and medical attention right away. Given everything that had happened, Kenneth and James didn't know who to trust, but without further delay, they called the service desk for help. Meanwhile, while they waited, the boys heard yet another startling scream right across the hall. Kenneth and James couldn't take any more surprises, but as they ran to see what was the matter, they found Crystal standing in the hall, screaming to the top of her lungs and pointing in her room. Even other guests began to emerge from their rooms too. Kenneth and James was afraid to even look in the room until Crystal shouted, "She's dead! She's dead!" It couldn't be, the boys thought as they raced down the hall. It was none other than Rachel, whom two appeared to have been raped and stabbed to death. "Oh my gosh," James said. "There's a fucking killer rapist on the cruise." Just then, several staff emerged, taking over the crime scenes. It was as if the whole group was attacked that was with Andrew that night. Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner was left with the task of contacting the parents, which they seemed unbothered by. Everybody else was in shock, and the two chaperones were awkwardly calm. 10 graduates were missing, 2 were dead, and another 2 had been raped. This was the cruise from hell, no matter how luxurious. Kenneth and James now believe the only reason they're still alive is because they didn't pass out from being drugged and never went back to their rooms alone. But where the hell was Lance, they thought. Chapter 24, The Cover-Up. The energy aboard the luxury paradise cruise was different now in light of recent events. Strangely enough, the cruise line sent out a satisfaction survey to all the guests and even offered free alcohol and free 30-minute massage sessions for the remainder of the trip. How thoughtful. What was ironic even more so is the deaths of Rachel and Andrew, nor the sexual assaults of Sarah and Bethany wasn't disclosed to the other guests at all. The cruise line even offered up a bogus explanation about Andrew's death, saying he unfortunately committed suicide. And the nerve of them for even stating that the 10 missing graduates had been found safe, which was a complete lie. No one knew the real truth except for the cruise staff, Mr. Sinner, Mrs. Honeypot, a few guests, Kenneth, James, Lance, Crystal, whom were all sworn to secrecy by signing a non-disclosure agreement provided by the cruise ship. They were even threatened if they had mentioned any of the events that occurred, they would be kicked off the cruise ship and would have to find their own way back home. What was more disturbing was neither the cruise line nor the chaperones made any attempt to contact the parents of the deceased student graduates or those missing. Something they found best not to reveal until the conclusion of the cruise. The Coast Guard search for Andrew was called off and his body was never found. It was said that the FBI and the Mexican authority had been contacted regarding the sudden deaths, but those in the know believed that to be a lie because no law officials ever came to investigate the matter. Yet a supposed internal investigation took place with no relevant findings or resolutions. A killer rapist was still at large aboard the ship, and literally nothing was done about it. Chapter 25, Day 5, Cozumel, Mexico. Our next port of call had finally arrived. Everybody was all too ready to disembark from the ship, if for nothing more than a different scenery. What was interesting was a few other boats, yachts, and ships was in the surrounding area, as well as, to everyone's surprise, Mexican authority officials were indeed awaiting our arrival. In fact, several officers, agents, and detectives boarded the ship as many guests made their exits. Kenneth and James still had Andrew's phone and took the opportunity to disembark from the ship so they could secretly call Andrew's parents. They needed the getaway anyway because Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner was watching them like a hawk. Crystal and Lance were completely distraught and traumatized, so they hung out together to comfort one another. As soon as Kenneth and James were far enough away and felt safe, they both made several urgent calls. First, they called Andrew's parents and unleashed everything they knew about what happened and what all has been going on aboard the ship. Andrew's dad was furious, and his mother couldn't stop weeping. Andrew's father assured the boys he'd see what he could do right away about the matter concerning the multiple suspicious deaths and those whom were still missing. He urged the boys to keep a low profile and stay safe as much as possible, considering the circumstances. They agreed, and the call was ended. Kenneth and James nervously looked around over their shoulders, and they both called their parents too. Panicked and afraid, the boys once again explained everything and told their family if they didn't hear back from them, then something tragic had happened to them. Just as they hung up the phone, both boys were approached by 3 unidentified men. They were thrown in a van and never seen or heard from again. Andrew's father, Honorable Sitting Judge Nathan Bledsoe, and his wife, Catherine Bledsoe, had a lot of connections within their family and elsewhere. After the call from Kenneth and James, the judge contacted his brother, who was chief of police, his nephew, who's a private investigator, and several of his politician buddies to disclose the urgent information. A lot of rumors and gossip began to spread, and an investigation was launched by their local FBI in Florida. But sadly, 3 days later, both the judge, Nathan, and Catherine Bledsoe were found murdered in cold blood in their home. Obviously, the judge got too close to the truth, and someone in power wanted to silence the Bledsoe family. The chief of police, Roger Bledsoe, was forced to resign after being found in a hotel suite with a male prostitute and drugs. Doug Bledsoe was later arrested for child porn and misconduct, which he swears to this day was planted on his devices. Meanwhile, everyone seemingly had a good time in Cozumel, Mexico. Distracted by fun, exciting attractions, shopping, and entertainment, Lance and Crystal hit it off really well. Lance even disclosed a little secret of his own to Crystal that no one else knew. During their lunch date, Mrs. Honeypot and Mr. Sinner joined them, and Lance revealed to Crystal that Mrs. Honeypot is his adopted mother. Come to find out, Lance was in on the setup the entire time, right along with his mom, Mrs. Honeypot. It's no wonder he simply left the group when Andrew and his friends were drugged and poisoned. Apparently, Miss Honeypot, being Lance's mother, was hidden from the students at their prestigious school to keep others from thinking he received special privilege. But in fact, the other staff and school administration knew. Shocked yet amazed, Crystal was told not to tell anyone else, and Mrs. Honeypot would look after her and take care of her too, since she'd be dating her son, Lance. Funny, because Crystal and Lance had just started hanging out, and she never said that, yet she now felt obligated by the forceful suggestion. Lance, Miss Honeypot, and Mr. Sinner lavished Crystal with gifts, and Lance even alluded to the two of them sharing a room for the remainder of the trip. Crystal was literally being groomed, bribed, and basically pimped out to Lance. It was like she was under some type of hypnotic spell or something. So much so, she literally ditched her own best friends without cause the rest of the trip. Meanwhile, back at the ship, while everyone was preoccupied, the captain and the security spoke with the local authorities, whom conducted a half-assed investigation and made a lame report of several different incidents while searching around. Needless to say, a crime was taking place right under their nose, as they didn't even know, or perhaps they did, and their whole presence aboard the ship was merely an illusion. Because during their supposed investigation, the 10 missing teens were transported over to a yacht that was sitting in wait upon the cruise ship's arrival. The graduates were sold into sex slavery to the Mexican cartel for $10 million, which was supposed to be $15 million, $1 million for each graduate. But due to things getting out of hand, the others were killed instead of taken. The graduates were then trafficked, abused, and sold yet again to high-profile wealthy parties. Kenneth and James were beat severely, as well as sexually assaulted. They too ended up being trafficked and sold to the highest bidder, but the cartel cleanup crew didn't pay for them. They were given free to rectify a problem they caused. Only 2 of the graduates was trafficked back to the United States, bought by some rich elite politician individuals. 3 more were sold to wealthy elitists in China, 4 were sold to wealthy elitists in Russia, and 3 were sold to wealthy celebrities in various parts of England. To say a whole lot more money was made off of the graduates than what the Mexican cartel originally paid for them is an understatement. They all come from well-to-do middle-class to upper-class families, so they're worth way more and will most likely be used as presidential models, high-profile sex slaves, and pimped out and passed around by the ultra-rich elite, celebrities, royalties, etc. Each of the graduates' families were very well compensated as well, as all of the grads were sacrificed by their very own parents for various different positions, titles, roles, fame, and or fortune. Nevertheless, the investigation aboard the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise was terminated, and all evidence and reports were buried. A large $1 million donation graciously made its way to the Mexican authorities as well. As for the FBI in the United States, the case is non-existent and furthermore a classified operation. Chapter 26, Project Mind Control. The day trip in Cozumel, Mexico was a success. Now departing, the cruise set sail to their next port of call, Georgetown, Grand Cayman, which they were due to arrive the very next day. Everyone seemed oblivious to the fact such awful tragedies happen aboard the ship. It was as if it never even happened, like some type of Mandela effect. People acted like they were having the time of their lives, especially the graduate party. What no one knew is an undisclosed substance was given to the guests unbeknownst to them. The substance was administered to food, drinks, desserts, etc., which quite literally made the guests forget the things that took place aboard the ship. High-pitched frequencies were even used during intercom announcements and through the speakers playing any music in the bar, the dance club, etc. It's safe to assume sort of a high-level social engineering human experimentation operation was also going on in the midst of all the other criminal activity. and no one was the wiser. To the extent of the evil that surrounded them all, to no surprise, not one person made mention to Kenneth or James not making it back to the ship before departure. What's so amazingly scary is for every person who either vanished or mysteriously died, it was as if they were never even there. Sarah and Bethany's lives were spared, but even they are left with the forever scars from the torture they endured. The pair of them was so traumatized by the whole ordeal, neither of them left their room for the remainder of the trip, only being heard from when they ordered room service. Lance played his role by keeping Crystal distracted. Between all the grooming, bribing, temptation, and programming, the horrendous scene Crystal had witnessed was merely relocated to deep in her subconscious. As previously planned, Crystal would spend all of her time with Lance, who was acting as her secondary handler. However, only those in the know was aware of what became of Rachel's body, but rumors has it by the cruise ship staff that her organs were removed from her body and sold on the black market, and the rest of her became shark food. It was smooth sailing from then on, and although under heavy delusions and illusions, the guests savored every moment aboard the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise. Chapter 27, Last Port of Call, Georgetown, Grand Cayman. The day for the last major attraction had arrived. Destination Georgetown, Grand Cayman. It was a beautiful sunny day with clear skies, as it was the entirety of their trip. Everyone was eager to make the most of their experience before the long journey home. Endless entertainment, shopping, and sights to see, as well as taking memorable pictures, was on all the guests' agenda for the day. Very few decided to stay aboard the ship, but those who did stuck out like a sore thumb. Many of them for no particular reason at all besides the fact that they were older in age and didn't really feel up to all the walking. But others, like Sarah and Bethany, just seemed to really be out of it. Finally emerging from the confinement of the room, but yet and still distant and isolated, with nothing more than themselves for comfort. Although the effects of the mind control took its effects on them, nothing could change the pain that they felt. The girls didn't attempt to talk to anyone about what they had endured. Besides, according to Mrs. Honeypot, they only could recall bits and pieces of the altercation anyway. Surprisingly, even Crystal decided to stay aboard the ship as well. She had become rather distant from everyone, including Lance. Crystal had even taken up wearing sunglasses while she was in public areas. It was all too obvious. Crystal was hiding a black eye, which came from none other than Lance, who had beat her. The spoiled brat jock that got away with everything, especially with his mother, Miss Honeypot, covering up all of his misdeeds, like drug use, violent outbursts, sexual misconduct, etc. Lance clearly had a mental illness that was going untreated, but it seems Crystal wanted to spend some time with her friends. Lance got angry and refused to allow her to do so. He hit Crystal repeatedly on multiple different occasions, forbade her from talking to anyone about Rachel's death, and he even forced himself on her sexually. The once bright, bubbly 18-year-old honor graduate was now distant, cold, detached, and drinking liquor constantly to calm her nerves, numb her pain, and ease her mind of the traumatic flashbacks she was having about Rachel. Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner was afraid Sarah, Bethany, and Crystal might be a problem later, but it was too risky to do anything to them aboard the cruise, considering all the previous events that had already taken place. Lance, of course, had already moved on to his next victim of choice, so Crystal was free of him for the moment. Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner carried on with their lustful affair almost a week aboard the ship, and neither of them even bothered contacting their spouses or children. A real piece of sinister work the pair of them are. The honorary graduates of Florida Esteem Preparatory Arts Academy enjoyed their last great adventure all together at Georgetown, Grand Cayman. Many of them were heading off to college in all different directions once they returned home, so they wanted to enjoy each other to the fullest before that time came for them to depart in their separate ways. Chapter 28. The Journey Home, Day 7. A full day at sea, sailing home. It had been a long week for the cruising guests, but many of them had a pleasant experience, and those who didn't, well, unfortunately, didn't live to tell about it. For the exception of a few whom Miss Honeypot and Mr. Sinner and the cruise security were watching very, very closely. Neither of which liked the idea of having loose ends, but if any one of them decided to disclose anything that they knew, the matter would be handled immediately. The captain planned a dinner and cocktail party, semi-formal, for the guests that everyone was eager to attend. It was amazing, the vibrant energy aboard the ship after such tragedy, and chaos plagued the enormous luxury vessel. But every event planned or otherwise went off without a hitch and definitely was a grand success. The honorary graduates felt like they were having a second prom, whether coupled up or with their bestie pal packs. The last night of the cruise was the biggest bash they had yet, and it was worth every minute. Chapter 29. Home at Last. After an 8-day cruise of luxury, murder, mystery, and mayhem, the guests aboard the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise ship had finally made it back home at last to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It had been an enjoyable experience for many, and others obviously not so much. The honor graduates' family and friends awaited their arrival. Sarah, Bethany, and Crystal were all too eager to disembark from the ship once and for all, vowing to never take another cruise again. Concerns, however, still lingered about those three, but as far as the cruise line, it was the problem of the state of Florida to deal with now. Everyone began departing the ship one by one in an orderly fashion as they all went their separate ways. Cherished memories forever from all their previous cruise destinations. Mr. Sinner and Mrs. Honeypot straightened up and put on a brave, bubbly face for their families as well, vowing to maintain secrecy about their exotic affair, although from time to time the dangerous duo rekindled their romance in local hotels. Lance, the spoiled menace prick, went off to University College a few weeks after their arrival. Crystal, however, just couldn't keep it together and eventually had a complete mental breakdown. Chapter 30, and they all fall down. Crystal is now in a mental health facility, heavily drugged and under severe mind control. Both Sarah and Bethany remained good friends and regained their strength after their arrival home, still haunted by brutal nightmares from the trauma they endured. Over the course of 3 months, the girls finally got the nerve and courage to tell their parents and anyone who'd listen about the horrors that went on aboard the ship. Many people, including their parents, couldn't believe what they were hearing. They eventually even sought to file a complaint and charges against the cruise line. An investigation was underway until both Sarah and Bethany went missing after a night at the movies together, found 1 week later floating in the river. They had both been brutally beaten and strangled to death. The community was in shock and horrified, but knew that the girls had been murdered to shut them up, just as the Bledsoe family, about what they knew that happened aboard the Tropical Paradise luxury cruise ship. The damage was done. Speculations and accusations spread about the missing graduates that never made it back home, and their parents who pretended like nothing at all was wrong. The end.